Hi, I'm Ellie. Thanks for joining me today. Okay, so do you know that there is an ancient monument that is so old that it threatens to completely collapse the timeline of human history? Yes, and I discovered this when a viewer made a request for me to look into this particular monument. We know that it's true because there was a paper that was peer-reviewed that was produced by a scientist. So the thing is, the paper appeared and then it was retracted. But there's a reason for that. He was threatened with complete ruin if he stuck to his story, because his story and his study threatened the establishment so much that it actually created a potential collapse in the future of everything we know about everything. What if civilization is not what we've always been taught it is? What if it's not what we think it is? And what if the real story was buried 26,000 years ago and now it's just beginning to wake up? Today we're going to be rediscovering a very real threat of changing everything. And it all begins in a tiny little place in Indonesia, in a quiet corner of West Java, beneath a dense forest and volcanic soil and a mountain that breathes lush vegetation and life into the atmosphere. Scientists stand there watching it and viewing it, and they kind of scratch their heads. Some of them ask themselves, how is this possible? And other scientists demand that it's just not possible. And the thing is, if what this mountain claims to prove is true, which is that it isn't a mountain at all, actually, that it was created by somebody with deliberate design. And if that is the case, then the reality created by hundreds of years of scientific discovery and dogma and chit-chat and papers and testing and explanations about the world, well, it's all wrong. All of it. The scientists are wrong, and they were always wrong. And our understanding of reality will unravel, and it will have to begin again from scratch, just as was predicted many thousands of years ago, because in prophecies that are often and almost entirely ignored by science, and I'm talking about the kinds of prophecies that I've been looking into, this is something that is a very real possibility. Now, what I'm talking about is the mountain called Gunung Padang, otherwise known as the Mountain of Enlightenment. It rises from the earth like a forgotten heartbeat that never did stop beating, despite the fact that we'd forgotten to listen to it. It's always been there for as long as anything else we know about. It has beckoned for us to decipher it, and now, finally, this might actually be happening. Some people say that Gunung Padang is a megalithic site. Others say it's the oldest pyramid ever built. But beyond the debates and the headlines lies something more ancient than what it might actually be. It's not really a story about geology or archaeology. It's a story about what happens when something in the past refuses to stay in the past. The inconvenience of suddenly realizing that the carefully constructed truth that we've all been living by, that everyone knows, that is taught in schools and universities, that's written in books, that keeps the infrastructure and the structures that are familiar to us and everything that we consider to be solid foundations of life, is wrong. Okay, so what you're about to hear may challenge the way that history is told, the way that time is measured, and the way that we understand ourselves. Because if Gunung Padang truly predates all known civilizations that have been proven by science, then what does that say about civilization or science? And what does that say about our human consciousness, about who we really are? Today's episode is not a history lesson. It's about turning back and seeing our ancient selves in an entirely new light, and recognizing that with this new awareness of who we once were, we might be able to rediscover the potential of who we're capable of becoming now, but also in the future. So it was in the early 20th century when the existence of Gunung Padang mountain was first recorded into the world maps by Dutch explorers. At the time, the explorers just thought of it as a kind of an odd-looking kind of a hill. Well, that was a bit of a clue from the beginning, odd. Odd tells you something. It had scattered upright rocks surrounding it, and it appeared almost hidden inside jungle terrain. In the 1980s, Indonesian archaeologists formally recognized it as a megalithic site. But what does that mean? All right. So in order to understand, it's important to properly define what a megalithic site is. A megalithic site is a location where large stones called megaliths were used in construction. What makes them specifically megalithic, though, is interesting because the stones are often massive, like kind of inexplicably massive, and they're arranged in ways that kind of are unusual given that there's no adhesives or any tools or anything like that used. So there's no mortar, nothing to put them together, but they seem to be arranged in a way that requires a tremendous amount of skill, and we would expect some kind of tools. But there's no evidence found by archaeologists to demonstrate that these tools were ever used. So it's a mystery about how the site was created. Stonehenge in England is an example of that. It's one of the most iconic megalithic sites in the world that many people have heard of. And these sites are typically considered to be prehistoric. And they carry deep cultural, astronomical, or spiritual significance. But it's always been assumed that the early humans of prehistoric age who created these ancient monolithic sites, like Stonehenge, for example, and even more so Gunung Padang, it's been assumed that they were primitive people. Hunter-gatherers who somehow, kind of inexplicably congregated together in a really uncharacteristic way in order to kill themselves over the course of many generations to make an impossible structure that appears to serve no purpose. No purpose for humans that tend to live in small pockets and hunt and gather and don't actually live in society. They didn't live in society, so why would they be creating these backbreaking, murderous type of structures, just killing themselves and killing their children and killing each other in order to create impossibly impossible structures with tools that don't exist and knowledge that doesn't appear to be part of that society? The explanations never really did make any sense, but that is the dogma of science, and that's what we've been taught. The scientists persisted because that is all that they were able to conclude from the evidence that they had found through the examination of archaeological artifacts and geological exploration. All they could tell was that the monolithic sites exist and that there were people at that time and that there were hunter-gatherers. They put it together, and no, it didn't make any sense. But then everything changed. In 2011, when an Indonesian geologist by the name of Danny Hilman Natawijaja, I actually got that right, began a series of seismic surveys and core drills. With ground-penetrating radar, his team mapped a subterranean structure that exists beneath the visible surfaces of this mountain. It turns out that what they found was a series of layered, geometric, deliberately created cavities deep inside a mountain. They also radiocarbon dated the organic materials that were buried deep inside the mountain, and this produced really interesting results. Some of the samples pointed to construction activity dating back as far as 25 plus thousand years ago. 25,000 years ago, maybe even a smidgen more. That would mean that Gunung Padang was built long before humans had discovered agriculture. Long before agriculture, at a time when they were still hunting for food with spears and living in caves, and actually potentially even earlier than that. It would date the construction of the mountain to a time before the last ice age had actually thawed. Blimey. So to the scientific establishment, this is an impossibility. Could a structure so vast and intentional really have been built by Ice Age humans? What kind of society would have possessed the visionary thinking, the planning, the coordination, and the technological ability to shape a mountain like Gunung Padang? Natawidjaja published his findings. The world of science immediately divided when they saw those findings into two different camps. You had supporters of the theory of Ice Age advanced human consciousness that considered the Gunung Padang discovery to be evidence of real potential for a forgotten epoch to be discovered. So this is a completely forgotten period of time of human evolution and existence, a whole new history of who we once were. Or perhaps finally, an admission of what many people have long suspected we once were. I think that's probably more appropriate. But then there was another side, and those were the skeptics. And the skeptics, well, what they did was they pointed to any perceived flaws in the dating techniques in this paper. They argued that the carbon-dated layers were natural, not human-made. And of course, never mind the fact that they were kind of geometric and that kind of thing. But anyway, and of course, the critics began to pounce all over Natawidjaja's published findings, putting real threat on his career, his potential livelihood, his reputation as a serious scientist and archaeologist. In their view, the burden of proof didn't lie in the possibility of there being a human genius being present, tens of thousands of years ago. They expected the burden of proof to exist in the clarity of the evidence. So it wasn't enough to find something that questioned their existing theories. It had to completely prove them wrong in order to even be considered a competing theory. That sounds like a pretty high bar, doesn't it? The stakes, after all, were really immense. Careers, thousands of careers around the world, had been built on the facts that define the systems that have been agreed already by societies, right? Societies are built to support and reinforce the systems that have been agreed. And if science were to acknowledge that Gunung Padang was a man-made structure and around 25,000 years old, then that would mean that every textbook and every single scientific timeline that currently exists would need to be rewritten. And the dawn of civilization would have to be completely reimagined. Ultimately, the pressure and the threats to his professional reputation were too much to handle, and so Natawidjaja retracted his paper. He retracted it last year in 2024. It took him 13 years to do so. But you know what? Once you've seen something, once you've heard something, once you've known something, you can't unsee it, you can't unhear it, and you can't unknow it. That's the thing about waking up and becoming enlightened. It's kind of a one-way street, and you can never go back to where you were before. But there's something deeper here that's deeper than academic quarrel. It's a discomfort about things that are unknown, right? A resistance to mystery. And it tends to be really personal because it threatens the status quo. And some people have really thrived in the status quo. They don't want to let go of whatever it is that has served them well so far. But the evidence is mounting. It's not just in Stonehenge or Gunung Padang in Indonesia. It's also Göbekli Tepe in Turkey and peculiar carvings from the ancient world that never get seen by tourists visiting Egypt. They are conveniently hidden away in perpetual construction and maintenance areas that are closed off to the public. But every now and then, a citizen journalist gets a very brief kind of moment of access. People like Graham Hancock, for example, and others. And they remember what they saw, and they write books about what they saw. And what they saw proves that there was something more going on in the human mind 25,000 years ago than what the official word is telling us. And the funny thing is, that more and more scientists are coming out of the woodwork to admit it as well, except by the time they do, they are generally retired in their 70s or 80s, and they no longer care about their, professional standing or the social circles or their ability to get published in peer-reviewed papers or to get, explorative funding or something like that. Their careers have winded down. And that's when they are willing to talk. And sometimes what they do is they come on and they talk about what they saw when they were in their 30s and 40s. And that's all the proof we need, really, because that's the truth. When you have nothing to prove and then you start talking, it kind of is a bit of a sign. It's all the proof we really need in order to know that Gunung Padang and Göbekli Tepe and others are pointing to the human truth that is far older than we're being told. In Mali, for example, the Doon people, they talk about the Sirius B star, which is a white dwarf star that's invisible to the naked eye. How did they even know about that? Their oral traditions describe its 50-year orbit, its density, its spiritual significance, and has done so long before Western telescopes were invented to be able to confirm the star's existence. The Dogon tribe also talk about the Nomo. And the Nomo are amphibious beings, apparently, who descended from the sky to bring order and knowledge to the earth. And one of the truths that the Dogon people claim were given to them by the Nomo was about the cosmic rhythm that astrologers refer to as the precession of the equinoxes. Actually, this is something that astrologers and astronomers agree on. The precession of the equinoxes refers to a kind of wobbling of the Earth's rotational axis, which is caused by the gravitational forces. So this is like the push and pull from the sun and the moon that are acting on the Earth's equatorial bulge. And so the axis of the Earth is slowly wobbling from side to side as the Earth is spinning. And a little bit like a top, if you spin a top on the table. And it takes almost 26,000 years to conclude a single cycle of this. So the Earth is spinning, but while it's spinning, it's also slowly kind of tipping from one side to the other. And the tip motion takes 26,000 years to conclude and go back to the beginning. While it's doing that, this is not entirely accurate, but it's accurate enough to be able to visualize it. So if you imagine the spinning top and the slow 26,000 year wobble as it's doing that, the alignment shifts backwards through each of the 12 constellations. The time that it spends in each constellation is around about 2,150 years. And given that there's 12, that adds up to just under 26,000 years that it takes in order to complete that full cycle of the spinning wobble. Each time it points to a new constellation, we've been able to see evidence that humans have been drawn to worship a specific kind of sun god. Yeah, so our understanding of the sun god, or the son of God, for example, has been different every approximately 2,150 years in accordance with the constellation that is relevant to the precession of the equinoxes. So 12,000 years ago, in the Age of Leo, that's the time when some people believed that Atlantis existed. Well, people lived as gods. That is the belief. That was their belief, that they lived as gods. They are believed to have been open and aware of their own divinity. In the next stage, the Age of Cancer, humans worshipped a lunar type of goddess. And then in the Age of Gemini, humans believed to have developed language and trade, which changed their belief systems yet again. And in the Age of Taurus, there was another female deity, apparently called Hathor. In the Age of Aries, there was Amun-Ra that developed. And of course, in the Age of Pisces, we see Christ or, Vishnu, for example. And I've discussed these cycles in far more detail, actually, in an episode that I did quite some time ago called Prophecy and Reality Recycled, which I'm going to add as a link in the description for today's show, if you are interested in understanding more about the worshipping of sun gods and how it's evolved over the ages. But for today, there is something to consider about this in the here and now, because now we are in what is believed to be the early days of the Age of Aquarius, so another age. And we are experiencing a new kind of God, perhaps, except as foretold by prophecy. I'm not sure we've decided yet who that God is. I can see evidence of there being more than one potential God that is rising to take form into our consciousness. But you know what? That's for another show, and I'm going to be working on that show really soon as well. So for now, we stand at the threshold of Aquarius, and a new sun god is emerging. Gunung Padang is a clue of that. And it's a clue that we may have actually been here in this moment in time before, just like so many other clues that exist. If Gunung Padang and Göbekli Tepe and other ancient sites of similar date timeline are as old as many believe them to be, then we are possibly approaching the end of the precession of Equinoxes cycle. We could be at the end of the 26,000 year cycle. If that's true, then that takes us into an entirely different kind of future. If we're approaching the end of a 26,000 year cycle that takes us to the completion of the cycle, well, what does that mean for humans right now? It could be something that is defined by our DNA, the DNA that took a really strange shift around 20-something thousand years ago. This is something that scientists are still scratching their head about. And it brings me to yet another point, because I think all of these things kind of marry together. Science has traced human evolution back to hundreds of thousands of years ago, they say, except they kind of haven't, because there's a missing link. Have you ever heard, the missing link? And scientists like to say that, I don't know if it's really missing, but it is. And this is a point in time when the DNA of the humans that we are today sort of suddenly got changed very slightly, like a little tweak. And our consciousness appears to have changed at around about the same time. And that moment appears to roughly coincide with a moment in time when suddenly the evolution of humans began to accelerate at unprecedented speeds. So think of what the Dogon tribe say. They say that the Nomo came. These are the amphibians that came from the sky, that came to teach the Dogon tribe, the humans at the time, the ways of the cosmos, the ways of the world and of the universe, at around about that time. And then we have these inexplicable structures that are appearing at around about that same time that don't seem to have any logical way in which they could have been constructed, given that the humans at the time were hunter-gatherers that hadn't even discovered agriculture yet. They were still spearing things with, one at a time to eat for food. And how is this even possible? Well, the DNA, a little tweak in the DNA occurred at that time too. And there are all kinds of theories about this, including the theories coming out of the Anunnaki stories, where the story is that the DNA was tweaked for a reason. And that was because humans needed to be kind of changed in a way so that they could perform the tasks that the Anunnaki needed them to perform. There's evidence also in the Bible, in the Old Testament, of there being this kind of slave ethos that was present in the early days of humanity, where this strange god that had so many different names, that was all kind of assimilated into a single name, may have actually been a series of different entities that weren't actually human, that were holding humanity for a purpose. All of this seems to kind of converge. So let's get beyond that to this Age of Aquarius thing. So the visual depiction of the constellation of Aquarius that we are currently aligned to in the early days is the water bearer. And the water element of the water bearer is really interesting because unlike all of the hierarchical structures that we are accustomed to in society, there's no such thing as dominant water. Water is like the ultimate equalizer because no matter how you pour water, it's always going to end up lying flat. Always. It always distributes equally. And this is a clue about what kind of God might be waiting for us. We might all be the next collective God, a bit like the people of Atlantis. So it's not about non-binary principles or anything like that. It's not about a merging of the masculine and the feminine. It might be a symbol of a collective awakening where our light is our awareness and our energy is our sovereignty. Gunung Padang might be a marker of that, the beginning of the last solar cycle, just like other Göbekli Tepe and other ancient artifacts appear to be markers of something that occurred somewhere around about 26,000 years ago. And for the first time, if we are coming full circle, maybe our sun god might be us. We might discover ourselves as the new sun god. So imagine if these structures were built to mark the moment of our departure from the divine consciousness. And our awakening is now our point of return into that divine consciousness. A recognition of the true age of these structures means recognition of our human potential. No wonder there is so much pushback from the official establishment. It would completely upend everything, just like has been predicted in prophecy. You know this concept of the return of Christ, right? Well, imagine Christ goes on a road trip. He goes on the road trip of the Precession of the Equinoxes. His departure is marked by all of these inexplicably created structures that are just too old to understand, that, scientists can't seem to get to the bottom of how they were created. So they say, oh, they must be natural. Except they're not. They are monuments of Christ's departure. Except what if Christ and Jesus were two different things? Jesus was a man and Christ was a consciousness. But what if the consciousness is traveling the cycle and it's just about to return? Is that the return of us? The return of our Christ consciousness back into the conscious awareness of our own divinity, back to the level playing field created through the pouring of water. The symbol of the Age of Aquarius. Gunung Padang asks us a fundamental question that helps us to understand who we are and what we may have forgotten. If it was built as the ice was melting and evaporating from the earth, will the water bearer mark another giant flood of the water's return? And will that water rise as a symbol of us rising in consciousness to become what we have always been, but briefly departed for that 26,000 years? Did we forget who we were? So many people speak about how the shift from 3D to 5D consciousness is a type of integration of some kind, from separation to unity, or from hierarchical control to the flattening out, kind of like water, like distribution of equality, from external authority to inner sovereignty. Gunung Padang kind of sounds a little bit like a metaphor for this kind of evolution. The discovery of its real age suggests that wisdom is beneath many layers of distraction and soil and volcanic ash. But it's always waiting. And despite our discoveries so far, it's still there. We really have no idea what else could be even further beneath what we've already found. The things that were long forgotten are still there, though. And if enough of us remember, not just with logic, but with the feeling that we have in our bones, then history becomes a living archive, and then consciousness becomes a communal current of energy. And we begin to realize that the new sun god is approaching, and that new sun god is us, returning from our 26,000-year procession of the equinoxes. Welcome to the new world. This is Ellie Dreams Down Under. I love knowing you're here, and I'll see you in my dreams.